most important discussion points today. Now, here is your host, Carlos Chapman.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carlos Chapman, and I'm your host of Getting Common. In my day job, I'm an associate professor at Washington Lee School of Law, where I teach and research in the areas of business law, including corporate governance and ethics, commercial law, including contracts, and I focused extensively on personhood rights. The topic of today's episode is it time to decriminalize sex work? And we'll be centering our conversation around the work of one of my guests today, India Thusi, whose groundbreaking work, including her recently published book, Policing Bodies, Law, Sex Work, and Desire in Johannesburg, has challenged the feminist notion that sex work is always a source of oppression for women. My guests, India and Erika Wilson, will help to explain some of the nuances of sex work, including how the criminalization can harm marginalized women. Now, I am very excited to have these women on the show with me today. I consider them both to be great friends, and they are amazing scholars. So I will allow them to introduce themselves. First, Erika.
Hello, thank you for having me, Carlos. My name is Erika Wilson. I'm a professor of law at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I teach a variety of courses, including education law, critical race theory, civil rights, and run a civil rights clinic. My research focuses on education in the law and the intersection between race and the law and the ways in which the law fosters racial inequalities in education.
Awesome. India.
Thanks for having me, Carlos. I've been enjoying the show and look forward to our conversation today. Greetings, everyone. I'm India Thusi. I'm a professor of law at Indiana University, Bloomington Maurer School of Law, and a senior scientist at the Kinsey Institute. I'm also a legal fellow at the Opportunity Agenda, a social justice communication lab. And my research and teaching focus on examining racial and sexual hierarchies, and I focus on how they play out in the policing and criminalization of various forms of sex work.
Awesome. I'm very, very excited. And if you do not have India's book, I just want to plug it for a minute. It is great. And it is available everywhere that you can buy a book, Amazon, anywhere you can get it. It's a groundbreaking work. It explores, goes into depth with South Africa. And it's just amazing. And she wrote it while she was pre-tenure, which we're told not to do. I also wrote a book pre-tenure. So, I don't think people who aren't professors understand what a feat that is. So congratulations on getting that published and out. All right, now India, probably makes sense to start with you. Your scholarship is focused heavily on challenging feminist notions and challenging us to reconsider our perception of sex work. And I think it helps to start with what the harm is. What harms come from making sex work a crime?
Well, first, Carlos, thanks for plugging the book. I've been really thinking about the ways that some of our assumptions about how we protect women have been really problematic, especially within the feminist discourse. And so I want to take a step back and just kind of situate where we are right now as a society. And I think there's this increasing awareness about the harmful effects of policing and the criminal system. There's recent polling in the United States and other countries that show that people are concerned about mass incarceration, aggressive policing, racist policing, and many people actually have been impacted or have family members or friends who have been directly impacted by the criminal system. So we recognize, the criminal system can bring harms with it. However, throughout history, there have been these strands of feminism that have heavily relied on punishment and incarceration and policing in order to vindicate women's rights. So you see this, especially in the area of sex work, where some feminists who claim to espouse these really progressive and egalitarian beliefs champion criminalization as a mode to protect all women from sex work. So they claim that sex work objectifies women and therefore should be subjected to some form of criminalization, some form of policing. However, the harms of the criminal system still exist in this area of criminal law and criminal regulation. So those concerns that people have about mass incarceration and aggressive policing also play out with the policing and criminalization of sex work. So particular to sex work, there has been racial profiling. So Black women are disproportionately arrested for prostitution offenses in the United States. There's also profiling of Black transgender people for merely being present on the street. There's exploitation that comes with policing and criminalization. And this is exploitation that's sponsored by the state. So this plays out through coercive police practices like sex in exchange for not getting arrested, or arrests for merely possessing condoms with you, or arrests for merely being present in public spaces, right? And in addition to these, direct harms that come from the enforcement and criminalization of sex work, there are also a number of collateral consequences that come from criminalization. So this might include, removal of children from a sex worker's home, or them losing custody due to the child regulation system and due to that arrest that they might have. There's also, a general lack of access to housing or banking because, the work that they're engaging in has been deemed criminal. So the harms that make, mass incarceration and aggressive policing problematic in other contexts also make, mass incarceration and policing as it pertains to sex work very problematic as well.
And you bring up some interesting points. And one thing that triggers in my mind as I think about it, two major things. One, that we talk about mass incarceration, the problems of policing system, and because sex work is woman-centered, I think that is one reason that it gets eliminated or gets just ignored. We've got the idea of paternalism that, we need to protect women, and the way to protect women is by making something illegal that women might do to free themselves, or that a certain type of woman gets profiled for and another type of woman does not, which makes me think of all of my days back in undergrad and learning in feminism and Donna horror complexes and all that kind of thing. And then the last thing it makes me think about is, and I'm not a criminal law expert by any means, but, I recall doing my work with women's organizations, how so many crimes that women commit, and especially women of color commit, are crimes of poverty, right? And so you've got the class disparities that come into play of the class of woman who has somehow found herself impoverished, and it ends up being a vicious cycle, right? You get arrested for having a condom on the street, and then you lose your children and you lose your home, and it just kind of snowballs, which kind of transitions me into Erika's work, because that vicious cycle, especially for Black girls, can start early. It can start in education. And so Erika's work has been very instrumental in exposing some of the disparities in education for Black girls, particularly disparities based on skin color, and just, groundbreaking work there that a lot of people have not focused on. So I would love for you, Erika, to kind of talk about how these disparities in elementary school can translate into harm later in the criminal justice system.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I would take a step back and say generally that school discipline for Black children has a very much linked to the ways in which we overemphasize criminalization as a solution, mainly due to our national fixation with maintaining a carceral state, which has some or many links to enslaved Africans, but that's a whole nother podcast. But I will say that in order to really understand the harm specifically to Black girls, it's important to contextualize it in the context of school discipline practices in the school to prison pipeline. So when I say the school to prison pipeline, I mean the process whereby children are funneled out of public schools via exclusionary discipline, things like suspensions and expulsions for what are often minor infractions or zero tolerance policy infractions, and then they end up funneled into the juvenile and adult criminal system. It's also important to understand the school to prison pipeline is particularly prevalent for children who attend schools with inadequate resources, which I've written a lot about: overcrowded classrooms, lack of qualified teachers, insufficient funding for important social needs like counselors or special education services, can lock these students into a second-rate kind of education and facilitate a second-rate educational environment that becomes more of a warehouse than a place where people go to get education. And so a good example of this is I once, through my clinic work, represented a young Black girl who was long-term suspended for bringing what was essentially a modified household item to school, and they characterized it as a weapon. Because they characterized it as a weapon, rather than receiving counseling for some issues she was having, she was charged criminally and also kept out of school, which led to her going down a terrible pipeline of involvement and things that were not good. It also made it difficult for her to transition back into school once her suspension was over, and made it difficult for her to graduate, and ultimately led to her becoming involved with the criminal justice system further. And so it's important to note this pipeline effect that I'm talking about, because for Black girls, the school to prison pipeline is real, and it's something that doesn't get a lot of attention. A lot of the focus on criminalization, our carceral state, and certainly the school to prison pipeline has focused on Black boys and a lot less on Black girls. But what we do know is that research has shown that Black girls experience actually exclusionary school discipline at rates that are 6 times higher than white girls. And they also experience suspension rates that are 67% higher than Black boys as well in some contexts. And critical, I think, for our conversation here today is that the reasons that Black girls are typically disciplined or given exclusionary discipline is because of subjective infractions, things like defiance or inappropriate dress or profane language, or things that, or even physical aggression. And a lot of these infractions are subjective, and the reason that Black girls are punished for those things is because they don't adhere to dominant cultural paradigms regarding how a girl should look and how a girl should behave. Teachers and staff members often filter girls' behavior through paradigms that prioritize white middle-class norms of femininity. So when Black girls express verbosity, for example, or innate leadership skills, that may be seen as defiance or kind of physical aggression. Interestingly, Black girls with darker skin are more likely to be punished for these kinds of infractions. And so when you consider that in the context of the school to prison pipeline, we have Black girls who are being subjectively punished more, often fed into the school to prison pipeline. It is a feeder system into pushing Black girls out of school, lowering self-esteem, and putting them in a position where they are more vulnerable and more likely to frankly end up in the criminal system and to turn to alternative ways to care for themselves, potentially such as sex work.
And what I found profound in this is, until I read your work, I never thought of these things. And I think my own experience in school, and I'm sure all three of us had this experience of, always being told you talk too much, always, getting in trouble for dress code more. And even if you're in the gifted and talented classes, and even if you're, I can think, and I never thought about the skin color differences, especially until I read Erika's work. And I started to think back to when I was in school and how I might get in trouble more than my lighter skinned friend, who is still getting in trouble more than our white friend. And you can see those undercurrents and those thoughts about femininity and who needs protection and who doesn't. And even the subjective part of it, right? If a dark-skinned Black girl is in an argument with someone else, who's the one who's wrong and who's the one who's being punished? And it's just how the social undercurrents that happen outside also happen inside the classroom. And what I also find interesting about both of your work is who is being ignored, and who are we choosing to protect, and whose interest are we ignoring when we make all of these policies, right? Who's being protected, who's being ignored, and why are we perpetually ignoring? And I would say, Erika, one of the most fascinating things about your work is learning that Black girls are disciplined even more than Black boys, because I would have never assumed that. I just never have assumed that. And it makes me realize, even as someone who considers themselves to be informed and educated, I still carry my biases in when I'm engaging with scholarship and thinking about issues of equality. Now, India, I first learned of the abuse to sex work pipeline, or discipline to sex work pipeline, from reading some of your articles. And I would love to expound on how we combine the phenomenons that Erika is talking about with the phenomenons that you're talking about, in addition to, maybe the generation prior, children ending up in the foster care system because their parents are in this loop, to just make it continue to be a system of oppression, such that simply being suspended from school or simply being in foster care can lead you to be in a sex work pipeline that then leads you into the criminal justice system.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I really appreciated the remarks that you were making, Erika. And, like Carlos, it had me thinking a bit about my own experiences in high school. And, there are a couple of things that I think connects with my work as well that I want to pull out. First, the ways that, when Black women and girls in particular engage in behaviors that are deemed to not fit into dominant norms, how they're subjected to increased policing and punishment as a result of that. And that's certainly something that you see in sex work in terms of who ends up being arrested for engaging in sex work, and how different forms of just being in the public, right, end up being interpreted as just necessarily being criminal. Right. And so you see that in terms of people being profiled and arrested, even when they're not engaging in sex work, but because they are, Black women or Black transgender women, they end up being, punished because somehow they don't fit into the norms of what we think women should be engaging in public spaces. And so, I think that's a real problem, whether it's in the school system or even outside of it. And there was another thing that, I wanted to kind of emphasize, is just the maleness of how the issue of, policing and incarceration is conceptualized, right? When people are speaking about mass incarceration, often it's depicted as this issue that affects, Black boys and Black men, right? Not an issue that impacts women or non-binary people. Although women and non-binary people are, subjected to really increased surveillance and increased numbers of incarceration, even at times when incarceration has been decreasing for Black men and boys. And that issue ends up getting ignored, right? And so, the fact that it's, conceptualized as just this male issue, and then women and Black women and girls are penalized for not, complying with certain norms, creates this problem where they're not getting, any protection or being deemed as worthy of protection, but at the same time, they're subjected to increased criminalization and policing, and it's not receiving, much attention, even though we're more concerned about mass incarceration these days. And so it does create this real problem. One thing that was interesting I found, when I was doing my research in South Africa, was even when I was doing my research with both police officers as well as sex workers to look at the ways that sex work was being policed there. And so I did ethnographic work, which required that I do participant observation. So basically join the police on their patrols and see how they're carrying out this policing of sex work, and then also join sex workers as they were working and, in their environments, and do interviews and that sort of thing. So one thing that was interesting that I found out that I wasn't expecting to find out was that officers police different classes of sex workers based on their perceptions of their beauty and based on how white they were on this, sexual hierarchy. And the ways that the differences in the policing of these different classes of sex workers really reflected these norms around, what we think, what types of women are worthy of protection. So for sex workers that they identified as being whiter and lighter skinned, there's this term in South Africa that people will use to refer to light skinned people like yellow bone. Those were sex workers who received additional policing but it was like a benevolent form of policing, right? And officers expressed this admiration about them, like, oh, these are women that we can respect. They're working girls, and they deserve police protection and benevolence from us. Whereas the darker skinned sex workers, darker skinned women, were deemed to be less professional and less worthy of police protection, right? And then allowed to have, sort of like this benign neglect, right? Like they're in areas that are too dangerous and they're not worth protecting. So I wanted to bring up that example because it illustrates some of the points that Erika was bringing out in terms of, even the ways that colorism also impacts how people are policed in these different environments, and they're policed more harshly, not always in ways that we expect, but it can have these really problematic outcomes in terms of them being able to, have their needs met and be treated with the dignity that they deserve. And so, going back to your initial question, Carlos, about, how does this type of policing and being subjected to these different sorts of, expectations lead to this pipeline where, marginalized girls may end up engaging, in sex work, is that, oftentimes, especially, for girls who end up being incarcerated while they're young, oftentimes people end up being incarcerated as girls because they're engaging in behaviors for survival. Right. And so, one mode of survival can be, sex work for people who may be leaving their home because of, there might be an abusive situation at home. And, because they're already perceived as being, problematic or, engaging in offenses that, Erika raised as being these defenses that require discretion on the part of like school teachers or police officers to assess whether they're complying with norms, they end up, experiencing arrest as opposed to receiving assistance or any sort of, social welfare. And so, what you find is that, a lot of incarcerated girls who engage in sex work are engaging in it because they're, they have these really difficult home environments. They're not able to seek resources from the people who are, should be providing them resources because they're already presumed to be, problematic in some sort of way. And then, something else that I've been hearing that's really troubling is that, when other people end up being in this similar situation, and they're speaking to other girls who might have been running away from home, and they tell them about the work they're engaging in, sometimes those girls, those young people are then, treated as, sex traffickers because they've introduced them to this other form of work or ways that they've been engaging in survival. And so that can, definitely be very problematic as well. So it creates the situation where people who are in these really difficult environments are not able to seek any sort of relief from the system, instead being conceptualized as just being, these criminals who are worthy of additional, criminalization, additional policing, and then often subjected to, incarceration just because they're trying to survive.
I'd be interested in knowing if either of you know, is there a distinction or disparities between, who gets deemed a victim of abuse or a victim of human trafficking versus who gets deemed to be a sex worker? And do those disparities break down both racially and on skin color at all? Or if y'all know.
Yeah, I don't know offhand, but I think it's a reasonable discussion to have based on just the way in which we see in the mainstream discourse how women are talked about, a victim of trafficking versus who is a sex worker, or using terms that are not even that appropriate or nice, I will say. I think that one point I wanted to raise is also the way in which, especially for Black girls, darker skinned Black girls in particular, schools serve as a socializing agent to form their expectations about how they do or don't deserve certain kinds of protections. So there's definitely a psychological esteem aspect that the poor treatment they receive in schools has on them, and the way it colors the way that other students are socialized to see them as well, which allows us to craft these narratives about, successfully craft narratives about who gets to be characterized as a victim versus who gets to be characterized as someone who is doing something wrong, being this awful person who is selling their body for sex. So I think that's just an important, selfishly given my area of research, to note the way in which schools serve as a socializing agent to allow all of these narratives to have legs or to take traction. I think it's something that we don't think about enough, the ways in which what happens in schools forms the baseline for the kind of social behavior we will accept and the kind of narratives that we find acceptable. So I say all that to say, without having knowing specifically the answer to your question, Carlos, I do think it's a good discussion to have around just general narratives and characterizations and how they take hold and the ways in which schools might play a fundamental role and how and why they're able to take hold.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add, so I'm actually going to plug this piece that I worked on, the feminist scripts for punishment. And I'm plugging it because, in it, I make this argument that there is this kind of script that's followed, especially when you're focused on like the sex trafficking narrative in terms of there being this ideal victim. And often this ideal victim is portrayed as being this young white girl. And in it, it's not a completely scientific analysis, but I did this Google search of, sex trafficking victim. And what I found, at least, last year and the years prior, which I would do this routinely, is always a young white girl and a dark looking person right behind them, right? And so that was the dominant image that you would get, which is really telling, and going to, Erika's point about what are the acceptable narratives around this issue. And it's often, you'll see these stories where there's this focus on, young white girls might get snatched up by this dark, often foreign, maybe Black person behind them who wants to sell them into the sex trades, right? So that narrative feeds into, this other narratives that exist, within our society that reproduce, white supremacy, that, portray, white female victims as being worthy of protection and, as a high priority, right? And I think that, your question kind of gets to this issue that exists around, Black women and girls are often not portrayed as being, potential victims, right? And often are just excluded from the conversations around this. Or, and part of the reason that happens is because it ends up being this effective script, an effective way to mobilize, the public around this particular issue. And, there has been, some research around the fact that, this narrative around sex trafficking, focusing on this, the young white girl and the dark, man that might snatch her up has, been an effective narrative strategy, effective communication strategy to mobilize people.
The reason I asked that question is because as both of you were speaking earlier, what popped in my head, especially when India was talking about South Africa and the light skin, dark skin disparities. And, when Erika was talking about, the scripts for school, I thought about when you walk through the airport or a bus station and you see the sign that's like, warning, this person could be a victim of human trafficking. And it's always either like, usually a blonde white child. And it even goes that far, right? Like it's even a blonde little girl with like someone who could be the nanny is how the only other way I could describe it, right? It's, it's either a foreign looking woman who like should be benevolent and a caregiver, but isn't, or it's like, little perfect blonde girl with scary, scary, dark foreign looking man. I have never seen in an airport, bus station, anywhere where they're warning you to like be on alert for kids who are with the wrong kind of people. I've never seen a child of color in one of those human trafficking posters. I just can't think about it. I can't think of it. And I think the reason is it stands out to me that I've like, every time I see one, I'm like, Jesus Christ, why is this like, how are they perpetuating the stereotype and continuing to perpetuate it? It stands out to me and it's marked in my mind. And, it fascinates me that it's an international phenomenon. It fascinates me that some sex workers get protection and some don't. And then it also fascinates me, as Erika is speaking, when I think about my own experiences in the classroom of, when you start to just be silent or start to let things happen to you and just let it go. And when that kind of angry Black woman stereotype starts, and the fact that it's like, did that start in elementary school? Right? Did I start thinking I will be an angry Black woman if I complain, or I'll be an angry Black woman if I speak up, or I will be belligerent and outspoken if I'm not going to be a go-getter like the white guy if I raise my hand too much. I'm going to be talking too much. And the fact that those scripts, that might play out when I'm in a faculty meeting right now and when I'm deciding when or not to raise my hand, that script of how I'm supposed to behave starts all the way in elementary school. And just fortunate enough to not be one of, the marginalized people who ends up in the system as a result of that grooming, right? Like just, it makes you think about your own, or for me, makes me think about my own experiences in my own context and how these things are so, so pervasive. Now the next thing I want to talk about is, first, protection isn't always good, right? Being the person who's lighter skinned or being the person who's white, who's being protected by the system that is criminalized is not always a positive thing. And I am quite sure as we start saying, well, we should just decriminalize this, people are going to come with all the feedback, right? Of, well, women are being exploited by it, and women, and they're, we can't go as far as decriminalization. And so India, you're the one who's deep in the weeds on sex work in particular. Why must we go all the way to decriminalization to resolve this problem?
Sure. Thanks for that question. Actually, I wanted to emphasize something that you said. So you described how we are groomed, right? How we're groomed to respond to these external factors. And it's just interesting to think the ways that like white supremacy like grooms us, right? It shapes our behaviors. And, as a result of it, we have that unfortunate position of having to respond and think about how we navigate through the world. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize that because that's such an interesting way to conceive of this world we're in and this problem. But, going to your question about, why should we have decriminalization? What about the harms of, sex trafficking, for example? What's interesting is that, the harms of criminalization and policing are rarely factored into arguments about why sex work should remain criminalized, right? So the harms from the system itself are often just ignored. And I think if you center intersectionality in your analysis, the criminal system isn't a source of protection for everyone. So intersectionality considers how various forms of systemic discrimination intersect with each other and create unique and distinct forms of harm and discrimination. So Black Indigenous women, women of color, Black transgender people, people of color with disabilities have experienced various harms from policing and the criminal system. And if you center their experiences, those harms are important, and it's assessing, how should we relate with these communities, right? And what do they actually need? So with this in mind, relying on the criminal system and policing to protect us doesn't make that much sense, right? What they need is support for their families. They need support of their material needs. We don't need additional policing and criminalization when these communities often experience policing and criminalization as a harm. So decriminalize sex work, I think, is merely just a first step to recognize that we can't punish our way into a just society. And the ways that I've been thinking about this issue, I've been thinking actually even beyond, removing policing and removing criminal law, and think about how do we construct the world that would actually make it so people can have their material needs met, where we can have a just society. What do we need, right? Is it also a focus on providing housing to people? Is it also a focus on ensuring that, everyone is able to make a living wage, if we even need a wage, right? And, ensure that everyone's material needs are met, that we have access to childcare, right? So, I've been starting to wonder, why do some feminists just focus on more police and criminalization when they can focus on these other areas where we're really not where we need to be as a society, right? Focus on the need to build up our social welfare so people are provided for. And I think that will address some of the harms that we see. But for sure, I think it's important to recognize that the criminal system, policing, is a harm, right? They bring harms, right? And most marginalized communities experience violence from that. And I think it's important to note that violence and instead think about ways that we could support those communities without relying on the criminal system.
Now, Erika, do you agree with her? Do you think we have to go all the way to decriminalization?
I do. And I think that it's a really important conversation to have. And people immediately get freaked out when you talk about decriminalization or talk about abolition, because I think the concerns presuppose that criminalization works and provides a level of protection. And I think India's point is dead on. It doesn't. In many ways, it reifies harms of the most marginalized. I think many of the same arguments regarding decriminalizing sex work exist in other contexts. I think of my former colleague, Lee Gutmark's really good book, I'll plug, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, right? I mean, some of the same consequences that exist when we continue to pour time, money, and resources into criminalizing persons who are engaged in sex work or persons who are engaged, have committed domestic violence, for example, fails to address the underlying reasons why these things happen and doubles down on harm rather than alleviating them. So to India's point, I think a better use of our time and resources and a better framework through which to examine this is to ask, how can we build a world where some of the exploitation harms with sex work, for example, don't exist? What if we had a universal basic income? What if we had affordable housing? What if we had schools that were actually providing quality education and giving people an opportunity to do a plethora of things rather than just warehousing kids? So these are all really important questions to ask. I mean, I think the other point that I think it's important to add to this conversation is that you can't really talk about this without talking about capitalism and the ways in which capitalism provides baselines for exploitation, this idea of competitive markets, et cetera. And so to the extent that we do talk about decriminalizing sex work, we have to talk about how we remove some of the ills of capitalism that come with it, like exploitation. And again, this goes to the point of providing things like basic incomes, affordable housing, to remove some of the exploitive parts of it so that people are able to make choices that aren't tethered to survival.
I love that you brought up capitalism because I am the business law professor here. And so to me, when things like drugs are criminalized, when things like sex work are criminalized, as someone who believes in free markets, I question why we will put that sort of morality in our capitalism, but not eliminate exploitation or provide social welfare in our capitalism. And so the answer that I have for that is, whose morality is it, right? So to me, the moral thing to do, if we're going to put morality with our capitalism, is to give universal basic income and to provide basic housing and provide people with food and healthcare. We have all this money in the world, and then open up all the markets and let people compete, because some of the people who are involved in things that are crimes don't need to commit crimes anymore if you provide a basic and open up the markets. But instead, we have some markets that are closed that people need to engage in to survive, and the markets that are allowed to exploit them are completely open. And so to me, my solution would be flip the capitalism, and I think you fix everything else. And so that's always been my approach of thinking about it. If we're going to be free market capitalists, let's put the regulation where it belongs and take the regulation off the people and provide some basics. So I'd love to hear what y'all's solutions are that probably aren't so law and econ economics based, right? If you decriminalize sex work, if you decriminalize these other things that are exploitative, what's your solution for protecting the people who are victims, protecting the people who are trafficked, while also allowing the women who want to do this because they enjoy it, to do it because they enjoy it, while also protecting and breaking this cycle? So either of you can go first. Like, if you could dream a world, what is your solution?
Well, I'll say that, decriminalizing actually may be a step to, get some of the protection for people who are exploited. And so in the context of New Zealand, at least, where it's, sex work is fully decriminalized, there's some evidence that, in fact, when you have decriminalization, sex workers are able to then report those incidents where there is, people who are being sex trafficked, because they would be the ones who would be closest to the issue and be able to identify people who may be sex trafficking victims. And so that's been something that's, really interesting. And even in the context of the United States, in the United States, there was this law that was passed that, FOSTA and SESA that really kind of limited the ways that people can advertise sex work services online and closed down a number of message boards that people would use in order to, speak about clients, collaborate, or even seek out clients. And so what some of the preliminary research is showing is that, as a result of closing down these online forums, there's been an increase in violence against sex workers. And part of the reason for this is because, sex workers are not able to share information about when there is this problematic client and a situation that you should avoid. They're not able to report different sorts of incidents or collaborate with each other, right? Or screen out their clients effectively in the same way they were able to before this law was passed. So again, I think this is an example, I guess going to your point, Carlos, I'm not sure that I would think that I was going to embrace a free market approach, but, going to your point that, if you, remove the regulation in this context, that in fact, that there would be, a less harmful outcome. And so I think, when you have decriminalization, people aren't being stigmatized, they're able to report these instances, that's actually going to, improve social welfare. And so I think of, decriminalization as that first step, but I think you're right that, decriminalization actually is just a first step. I think, thinking about the ways that people can still have access to housing, how they don't have barriers in that context. Another barrier that, sex workers encounter is access to banking, right? And so just being able to, exist in society and, access different resources that we need to exist in the society that we're in is really important.
Erika, what's your dream world like?
Yeah, 100% on board with all that India said, especially about the safety aspect. I mean, another example, many people don't know, but I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. So sex work is legal in some parts, in certain brothels in Nevada. And one really interesting thing growing up in Nevada that I always looked at closely is unions. There's actually a sex workers union, which is really helpful because we often don't think about long-term security. So things like pensions and other aspects of financial security that maybe a sex worker can't cultivate under this criminalized system would be something that you could put in place if we decriminalize sex work. So definitely in terms of increasing safety, to India's point, also thinking about longer term economic security, decriminalization could bring that if we allow it for unions. But most importantly, I do think it's about building a world where people are able to engage in sex work because they want to, and it's not an exploitive choice that they are pushed into because they feel like they have no other options. And the only way to do that, I think, is much of the same conversation that surrounds abolition and building the world that we want, right? In terms of addressing root causes, things like there should be a human right to housing that we recognize, safe and affordable housing, not just any housing, a human right to food, to being able to make. Every state has a state constitutional provision that requires a system of free public schools, but it doesn't require that they actually provide a high quality education. So these kinds of societal constructs are necessary in order to, I think, build the world that we want. Decriminalization without addressing these other aspects, I think, leaves us still vulnerable to levels of exploitation. So I think this conversation has to be contextualized in the broader sense of addressing our other structural problems and issues that can lead to sex work being exploited rather than a free choice.
Now, one critique I've seen, in the feminist literature is that, even with things like OnlyFans and the online platforms and, pornography going on the internet, the argument is when you decriminalize and make it more available, it's not a feminist notion to decriminalize because women are still being exploited. The wrong people are making the money, right? It's the pimps making the money. It's the video producers making the money. And so if you decriminalize, you simply have more perpetuation of the oppression of women. And India, you started earlier with a discussion of intersectionality and how that is singularly focused. I would love to hear how you have addressed the feminist pushback for what you have been proposing.
One thing's really interesting about sex work, and actually pornography in particular, is that it's the one profession where women actually make substantially more than men, right? So there is a gender pay disparity, whereas women actually make substantially more than the men in the profession. So I know there is this assumption that, women are somehow, necessarily always being exploited in that area. But in fact, that's not really the case in a lot of contexts. And so, with an example like OnlyFans, OnlyFans generally doesn't have pimps who are, serving as intermediaries. And in fact, what you find in online spaces and what's happening online is that, people who are engaging in sex work don't need an intermediary because they're able to use these online platforms to directly screen and interact with their clients. And so that's what you have with OnlyFans. And so, in many respects, the online space is allowing people to kind of avoid and, prevent some of the harms that you might find in street-based sex work and prostitution, which has been, interesting to kind of observe. But, the concern about there being, still lingering effects of exploitation, despite there being, this online space, I think, there isn't really evidence that that's what's happening, that in fact, we're seeing substantial evidence of people who are, willfully engaging, especially in these online spaces, which requires some access. If anything, I think there might be more concern that, some people aren't able to access these spaces and maybe end up in even more vulnerable spaces where they have to engage in street-based sex work, or they might not have access to internet. And so that's a risk that occurs. But I'm not as troubled that, by being able to engage in sex work online, that people are going to be more vulnerable for exploitation, because the evidence suggests that, in fact, they're able to avoid some of the more exploitive aspects of street-based sex work. So, it's still a developing area, and I'm, been kind of paying attention to what's happening, but it doesn't seem like, that's really, playing out there. I do want to note, though, one thing that may be a valid concern is, ensuring that people and platforms take down materials that, people haven't consented to, be shared online. And so that's something completely different, and dealing with non-consensual materials that are being shared. And, I think Daniel Citron has done a lot of, great work in that area, as well as, Marianne Franks, but that's really something else. And I think, that should be immediately addressed. But in terms of people, willfully, uploading the materials and engaging online, I think, they're able to, avoid some of the exploitation that occurs in, live encounters.
Very true. Very, very true. Now, Erika, in your work, you believe in the decriminalization, you've done this work in the class with education system and things like that. And, I would love to hear from you about, what's missing when people don't take the intersectional approach, what is missing in giving consideration to, the harms of criminalization versus decriminalization when we just focus on one population.
Right. I mean, I think a substantial harm when we only focus on one population is that we don't look at the unique ways in which certain individuals who have identities that intersect with powers, with structures that subordinate, what their experience with criminalization will be like. So with Black women, for example, we assume when we don't take an intersectional approach, we assume that criminalization will protect them the same way that it might protect a white woman, for example. And that's just not true. I mean, many of the ways in which Black women are can be exploited or abused in sex work, the criminalization makes it worse in terms of a lot of what India talked about in terms of racial profiling, in terms of who actually gets arrested, who's actually, how one is treated once one is actually in the criminal system. All of these things matter in terms of the ultimate analysis of whether or not criminalization actually is effective in terms of protecting, if that's the stated goal, if it's protection. And I think if that's the stated goal, then you really do have to examine, put an intersectional lens on it. So if you're talking about trans women, for example, their experience with criminalization is going to be totally different than a cis white woman, for example. And so like with other systems, failing to take an intersectional approach gives you a shirt that doesn't quite fit, and you often frame the problem wrong and get the wrong solution.
Absolutely. Now, I'd like us to close out with your predictions. We've seen the decriminalization of things we probably never thought would be possible before, like marijuana. Do you believe decriminalization of sex work is possible? Do you think we can see it happen? I'll start with you, Erika. Do you think it's possible?
Tough question. Do I think it's possible? Yes. Do I think it's plausible? I'm less optimistic, but yes, I will say possible, but not plausible. I think the entrenched misogyny and misogyny norm make it less likely, but I'm really interested to hear India's prediction.
What do you think, India?
Oh, I'm feeling like an optimist, which is rare. So I think with sustained organizing, cultural engagement, cultural strategies, legal and policy advocacy, that decriminalization is absolutely possible, within some years. I think with that type of strategy, it's possible. And, as a kind of a side note, I think the lines between sex work and other forms of work are increasingly blurring. And, I've been writing a little bit about that, but, the concept of the metaverse, which has been a bit of a punchline since Facebook's announcement, but really predates Facebook and has nothing really to do with Facebook as much as, Facebook suggests. But I think it encapsulates increasingly how we're leading our lives and the forms of sex work that occur in online spaces and this metaverse kind of frustrate common assumptions about sex work and how sexual intimacy occurs. And I think they're going to force us to re-examine our approach to the regulation of sex work, because some of our regulations pertain to it. And I don't think people necessarily think that they're engaging in criminal activities when they're on these online spaces, but the laws are constructed with such broad language that, in fact, often they are. And I think that will put the constitutionality of a lot of laws that regulate sex work and prostitution in question. And I think things will be evolving. So I think the advocacy and those cultural strategies is important. And I also think that naturally certain things are happening on online spaces that will force us to re-examine sex work.
I don't think we ever have optimists on this show, so I appreciate you for probably being the first one and saying something positive for a change, because I now have faith and I believe because you believe. So it gives me some hope that maybe we can see some equality and justice in the system. So I want to thank you, India and Erika, for joining me on the show. I always don't have enough time. I have like 20 more questions I could ask both of you. If you're interested in reading more about either of their work, it is available on SSRN. Both of them are also easily Googleable. We advocate Googling Black women and citing Black women on this show. So look up their work on SSRN. And if you don't have an SSNR account, you can Google them and see their work on Google Scholar too. You can pick up India's book on Amazon and everywhere books are sold as well. Now, next week, I'll be joined by Anat Beck and Darren Rosenblum, who will continue my focus on feminism with a discussion of their article, No More Old Boys Club, which makes the groundbreaking proposal about how we can achieve gender diversity on corporate boards. If you ever miss the show live, you can catch it streaming on Voice America Network and anywhere you listen to podcasts. And you can always find me on social media at Carlos C. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you again so much to my guests. It was a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, great show today. Good job. All clear.
Thank you.
Mhm.